Ranald McKenzie is acting erratically. Colonel and veteran of the Union Army during the Civil War, he was used to having success. For the last 72 hours, he had been schooled by an opponent that he felt was beneath him. For decades, Mexicans and Texans on the western frontier had been harassed and damaged by this enemy. Depredations were constant. An entire village of Comanche had escaped him while he was tracking them on the high plains, the Llano Estacado. On a humiliating return march of his failed mission, his soldiers cornered two Comanche stragglers in a mess of brush and boulders. Leading from the front, screaming orders, furious and without thought for his own safety, Mackenzie worked to either capture the trapped Comanche or kill them trying. His mind, clearly elsewhere, feverishly replayed the last few days. He was prepared, and still his men had horses stolen. They had been injured and killed. And despite all of the losses, they were so close to overwhelming the Comanche. An entire village would have been captured. It slipped through his fingers. Men, women, children, their supplies, all in numbers that would have effectively put this fight to an end for good. His victory, stolen by a storm. A blue norther allowed the savages to escape as he and his men almost froze to death. How did they just keep moving? Are they invulnerable to the freezing cold? But Mackenzie wasn't just hunting any Indians, or even Comanche. He was hunting the Quahadi, the last free band of the Comanche, the most remote, the most brutal, and the most aggressive. The ones responsible for countless stolen horses, destruction, murders, and tortures. Just weeks earlier, the citizens on the frontier, he could still picture their faces, were begging the military to put an end to it. They were led by a war chief, Quanah Parker, a large, imposing man, unwilling to compromise with the whites he hated invading his land. But Mackenzie was determined to make him surrender, like the two warriors that he had trapped in the brush. Still frustrated, he snaps back into the moment. As he screamed orders at his men, an arrow launched from a hidden location and lodged itself in his thigh. Revealing themselves, the surrounding soldiers sent a volley of rifle fire into the brush, killing the warriors. They had made a choice, as all Indians had to. Surrender or die. Mackenzie was pulled away. Injured and embarrassed, he examined the arrow in his leg before they pulled it out. Already sporting several significant wounds from military engagements, this was nothing new. After being treated for his wounds, it would take him several weeks to heal, but he would be back before anyone expected him to be. He had a mission that he was dead set on completing. He was determined to learn from his mistakes and be back doing as he had been before, conquering the Comanche. Welcome to Dates and Dead Guys. But before we get to our story, I do deep dives on historical topics I find interesting and talk about them in a way that I would to my friends. If you like these kind of stories, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel, or comment on anything that comes to mind. If you really like the channel, be sure to check out my Patreon. The support helps me keep the lights on and improve the content. That information's in the episode description. But let's get back to our story. Just a few years earlier, in October of 1867, a delegation of Comanche and Kiowa met with Americans in Kansas to discuss peace. A recent uptick in Indian raids had put the Americans in a difficult position. The post-Civil War downsized military led them to a less aggressive policy toward Native Americans, but the damage caused by raids as the frontier spread west was forcing them into action. This meeting, and the resulting Medicine Lodge Treaty, wasn't meant as a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. There were free tribes on the plains, and the U.S. military would no longer have it. Under threat of force, tribes like the Comanche and Kiowa were told to cease all warfare against white people and to settle on designated lands away from white settlements and reservations. If they did, they would be supplied with, among other annuities, food, seed, and education and farming. Ten Bears, an elderly Comanche chief, was present. His band was the Yamparica. He was in his late 70s, and a few years before Medicine Lodge, had traveled to Washington, D.C. to appeal to the politicians and the president or Great Father. He had seen the size and power of the Americans. He understood in a way that most Plains natives couldn't comprehend. In one of the most famous speeches ever recorded of Native Americans, he blamed the white men for forcing his people into combat. He said it was the Americans who sent out the first soldier. He said that the blue-dress soldiers killed their warriors, and that the Comanche mourned by cutting their hair. He said his people attacked in response. We killed them, and their scalps hang in our lodges. He said their women laughed when they took them. He said they didn't want the houses that the Americans were offering to build, that they were born under the prairie and wanted to die there in the land that they lived and hunted on, like their fathers before them. The thought of giving up buffalo for sheep and farming angered the young men, who wouldn't hear of it. He was resigned. He knew that in time the Comanche, who numbered maybe 5,000 total, would be overwhelmed. So despite his speech, he put his mark on the treaty with the other 9 chiefs. But he knew he had no power over the young warriors. And he knew that one Comanche band, the Quahadi, didn't attend the meeting at all. If the military wanted submission from them, they would have to go hunt them down where they lived, on the high plains. In the 2 centuries prior to the Medicine Lodge Treaty, the Comanche were the most powerful group of Native Americans in North America. If you want to argue about that in the comments, you are free to try. But mounted and on the plains, they had no match. Like many Native Americans, they were master archers, but what made them different is that they fought entirely on horseback, something other Native groups, even tribes like the Lakota with expert horsemen, didn't do. They were renowned for their abilities. 2 of the most famous descriptions of the Comanche come from Colonel Richard Dodge and George Catlin in the 1800s. Dodge was a commander of the U.S. military detachment charged with protecting westward settlers. He described the Comanche as the finest light cavalry in the world, superior to any mounted soldiers in Europe and America. George Catlin, who documented Plains Indians in writings and art, corroborated such evaluations. His beautiful paintings capture the way they lived and moved on horseback. As he described it, the American soldiers were dumbfounded by what they saw. In his writings, he wrote that, on their feet, the Comanche are one of the most unattractive and slovenly-looking races of Indians. But the moment they mount their horses, they metamorphosed, wrote Catlin. Without hesitation, Comanches are the most extraordinary horsemen I have seen yet in all of my travels. We often think of 5 main bands of Comanche. The Panatica were the southernmost band, the honey eaters, sometimes translated as wasps. They were the ones most commonly in conflict with Texas in the early days of the Republic. By the 1850s, assaults and disease had devastated them. They were the first to fall. The Yamparica, yap eaters, Nakoni, wanderers, and Kutsutika, buffalo eaters, were the next to come in contact with westward moving whites. Their bands, minus some Kutsutika, were the ones that made up the Comanche present at the meeting that made the Medicine Lodge Treaty. But the Quahadi, the antelope, they were absent. Their home was the last to feel the encroachment of the whites. It was the most west and remote. It was also the most brutal. The high plains, the Llano Estacado, was fully without timber for building or cover. The area was entirely trackless and is often described as an ocean of grassland. In the summer, it is blisteringly hot, and without knowledge of where water is located, venturing into the high plains would leave you lost and sure to die. In fall and winter, storms sending temperatures plummeting 50 degrees in a matter of hours, called northers, could send blistering winds, sleet, hail, and snow. It was a place entirely inhospitable to human life. A wasteland. That is, except for people, like the Quahadi. The Americans had sent heavy artillery accompanying slow-moving dragoons to fight them, but they could never find them, let alone move with them. Comanche would never engage forces like this. It wasn't in their favor. It's not how they fought. There were faster, more mobile forces, but the large, vast area on the high plains of Comancheria were no place for small regiments of groups like Texas Rangers. The high plains and the area directly around it formed a Comanche barrier to American westward expansion, as they were dead set on keeping what was theirs. A point made in 1864 when the U.S. military sent a force of over 300 soldiers, led by famous Indian fighter Kit Carson, on a retaliatory strike against the Comanche and Kiowa at a place called Adobe Walls on the Texas Panhandle. The tribes had been harassing wagon trains on the Santa Fe Trail. The Indians argued that the wagon trains were killing buffalo, which was true. The buffalo were the reason why they were on the plains. It was their most important resource. Over 1,400 Comanche and Kiowa warriors gathered to repel Kit Carson's invasion. And they did. They forced a retreat. It was proof that the territory was under their control, not that of the whites. Not yet. In the 1860s, a promising young warrior rose up among the Quahadi, pushing resistance against the whites. His name was Quanah Parker. Ironically, Quanah himself was half white. In 1836, during the Parker Fort Massacre, a young 9-year-old girl named Cynthia Ann Parker had been kidnapped by the Comanche. Luckily, spared of violence, she was adopted and assimilated into the tribe, a practice that wasn't uncommon following raids, although it could very easily have gone the other way. In time, she would marry a chief, Pita, who loved her. Quanah Parker was born to them in 1845, probably. Quanah, originally a Nakoni, like his father, grew to hate the white man. It is debated whether Pita died at the Battle of Peace River in 1860 or a few years later of war wounds. But regardless, Quanah had another reason to hate the white man. They had taken his mother. Cynthia Ann Parker was captured at Peace River, along with his infant sister, Prairie Flower. After 25 years, a marriage, and several children, she was a full-blown Comanche. She wasn't taken willingly. Quanah hated the whites for what they had done, and not knowing what had become of his mother, vowed revenge against them. Quanah would soon become a strong Comanche war leader, and the most influential chief among the remaining free Comanche. He helped lead the raids against those who were trespassing on their homeland. It is not clear to me whether or not Quanah was at the first Adobe Walls fight in 1864. Although just a teenager, he was already a full warrior in the tribe, but he will be at the next one. We'll get to that in a little bit. Events like this and more raids led to the Medicine Lodge Treaty in 1867. The Civil War ended just a few years prior, and for years the North and South were forced to focus on each other instead of the Indian problem. But following the Medicine Lodge Treaty, every Comanche still resisting on the plains was considered an armed enemy of the United States. The official presidential policy under Ulysses S. Grant in 1870 was of assimilation, to civilize and Christianize the Western tribes. But this plan had contingencies. If tribes were not willing to be civilized, then the military would help them, by force. All that was needed was the political will to hunt them down. A small crowd desperately pleads with General William T. Sherman. They have met with him at Fort Richardson, in Texas, with a petition for action against the Plains tribes. They list the names of 129 murders that have taken place in just Jack County over the course of the last decade. Sherman is unmoved. He knows the damage being caused on the frontier. He has seen this before. Jack County was far from the only place being harassed by Indians. The frontier, since the Civil War, had contracted as a result, up to 200 miles in some places, as people fled for more defended areas. But for Sherman, his objective was to uphold Grant's peace policy toward Native Americans. Ranald S. McKenzie watched the proceedings. Like Sherman, he was a veteran of the Union in the Civil War, only his experience was far different. With eagerness and frustration, he snapped the nubs on his former right thumb and index finger. Mackenzie was 31 years old at the time of this meeting in May of 1871. He was a colonel, although he had temporarily been promoted to a brevet general during the war. He had served at Antietam and Gettysburg, as well as a host of other notable Civil War engagements. He was even present when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. He was well regarded and promising, but his many injuries had made him irritable and impatient. He had been shot in the shoulder, taken shrapnel to the leg and chest, and most notably, he was missing 2 fingers on his right hand, from where a shell fragment tore them off in 1863. This wound led to his soldiers calling him Three-Fingered Jack, not to his face. He didn't tolerate insubordination, and he wasn't well liked because of his strictness. But he was better known by the name the Indians gave him, Bad Hand. Both scouts and enemy tribes got to know him well during his time leading the all-black Buffalo Soldiers against tribes that had discarded the Medicine Lodge Treaty, work that he did before taking over the 4th Cavalry at Fort Richardson. So both Mackenzie and Sherman were present at Fort Richardson, when that same evening, out of the black of night, a wounded man entered the fort, screaming about an Indian attack on his caravan. Considering the stories that had been heard that day, it was easy for them to believe. Sherman sent Mackenzie to investigate. What Mackenzie found horrified the people of the region, and would change everything. The same day that General Sherman had met with the citizens of Jack County, on May 18, 1871, a 12-wagon-long train with as many men was transporting flour and cornmeal to various forts in West Texas. When they reached the Salt Creek Prairie, which was halfway between Fort Richardson and Fort Belknap, they spotted a large group of Indian warriors, mostly Kiowa, but with Comanche running mates. Henry Warren, the leader of the wagon train, had his men shift the wagons into a defensive ring, with the livestock in the middle, but it was no use. The force of over 100 warriors quickly overwhelmed them. 5 members of the wagon train were able to escape, while the warriors were preoccupied with copious supplies in the wagons. Raids such as this were a growingly common occurrence. Treaties like Medicine Lodge were not working. Even tribes on reservation would often leave to conduct raids, frustrated that the provisions that they had been promised were not provided. When Mackenzie and the 4th Cavalry found the site of the raid, it was clear that this one was especially brutal. Mackenzie wrote to Sherman, who had left Fort Richardson, quote, "Statements concerning the wagon train are not exaggerated. 5 mules lay dead around the wagon. Found 5 men about the wagons with heads split open and badly mutilated." End quote. 2 additional bodies were later found, cut down some distance away as they fled. A doctor further examined the bodies. He said that they had shown signs of having been hit with many arrows, and he wrote about one man in particular who had been captured and tortured. Strapped to a wagon wheel and having his tongue cut out, the raiders built a fire under him. The doctor wrote, quote, "Owing to the charred condition of the soft parts, it was impossible to determine whether the man was burned before or after his death." End quote. Knowing the history of these tribes, I would be willing to stake a bet. In an ironic twist of fate, it was later learned that the same war party had passed up the opportunity to attack General Sherman's small group earlier that day. One of the Kiowa medicine men had advised them against it. So perhaps it was this brush with possible death combined with the savage nature of the attacks that caused Sherman to begin to take the Indian threat more seriously. There was a noticeable shift in his policy in dealing with them. This was the catalyst for the end of diplomacy. The military would now be much more offensive. With new resolve, Sherman assigned Mackenzie to bring the fugitives to justice, and it didn't take long for the military to start making arrests. In the interest of brevity, the Kiowa chiefs involved were quickly brought to justice. A Kiowa chief, Satanta, who had signed the Medicine Lodge Treaty, freely admitted to the massacre. Nevertheless, the incident added credence to the citizens' pleas to Sherman to do something about the raids. All Plains Indians not on the reservation were enemies of the United States, and although the Kiowa were largely responsible for the Sand Creek Massacre, the biggest offenders of consistent brutality against whites on the frontier were the Quahadi Comanche, led by Quanah Parker. Ranald S. McKenzie was now tasked with, aggressively, bringing them in to kneel. Into September of 1871, Mackenzie was preparing to guide 600 cavalry soldiers as well as 20 Tonkawa scouts into the high plains in the hopes to find the Quahadi. The Tonkawa, referred to as Tonks by the men, were furious blood enemies of the Comanche and were willing to assist in hunting them down. Their tracking skills as well as their knowledge of the land were valuable to the Americans. In early October, the Tonks had led Mackenzie to Blanco Canyon, a valley about 1,500 feet wide that goes for 30 miles. It's near the White River, at the base of the Panhandle in northern Texas. At first, they found no Comanche. It was thought that the operation may never fully get off the ground, but as they often did, the Comanche found them. One evening, the Tonks witnessed Comanche scouts watching them from a distance. That night, they were attacked. After midnight, as tired soldiers sat around crackling campfires, a war party led by Quanah Parker ran into camp war-whooping and stampeding the horses. In the chaos, Mackenzie ordered the men to control their beasts, but the powerful animals reared up and ran, ripping the lariats out of their hands. No soldiers were killed, but 70 horses were run off, leaving a huge portion of the cavalry without mounts. One of the horses even belonged to Mackenzie, a beautiful gray pacer, a horse that would have been heavily prized by the military and Comanche alike. All of this was recorded by one of Mackenzie's lieutenants, Robert Carter. He called losing the horses the first disaster of Blanco Canyon. The next came the following morning. Mackenzie ordered Lieutenant Carter and a number of his men to trail the stampeded horses, and hopefully collect some of them that were lost. Carter soon discovered some Comanche trying to round them up. The Comanche fled when they saw the soldiers, and foolishly they chased them across a gully to a bluff. It was a trap. Carter recalled, quote, "At the base of the bluff, the Comanche could be seen in the clear light. The ground fairly swarmed with Indians, all mounted and galloping toward us with whoops and blood-curdling yells that took the breath completely from our bodies. The picture is indelibly stamped upon the brain." End quote. Hundreds of Comanche warriors swarmed like bees on their horses, dressed in black war paint and adorned with buffalo war bonnets and feathered headdresses. Quanah Parker was among them, leading the party. Carter and his men tried to hold them off. Their lever-action Spencer carbines were able to keep them safe for a while. As the Comanche bluff charges grew bolder, Carter ordered his men to turn their horses and make a run for cover at the gully they had crossed a few hundred yards back. During the retreat, one of the privates in the group, seeing Greg's horse, began to give out in a sprint. The Comanche noticed the tiring horse and rushed to him, with Quanah leading the way. In his book, Carter wrote about watching Quanah in this moment. He described him as the incarnation of savage, brutal joy. As he ran up to Greg, whose carbine had been jammed, Quanah raised a pistol, close enough to hit him with it, but shot him in the head. This was the second disaster. What happened next was like a movie, in the way that if it happened in a film, you would roll your eyes. Just before Quanah and the Comanche are able to overrun the small group of soldiers, they notice a trail of dust a half-mile or so off in the distance. They knew this meant the rest of the army was coming. Mackenzie and the rest of the force heard the gunshots. They rushed to the sound, hoping fully armed to be able to take on the Indians. Before doing any more damage to Carter and the others, they retreated. They were able to escape, moving up the bluff from the canyon into the high plains. Over the course of the next few days, Mackenzie and Quanah played a game of cat and mouse. It had become clear that the army had stumbled upon an entire Comanche village. As they retreated from the army, they moved with women, children, thousands of horses, and all of their housing and supplies. The army was in wonder at how well they were able to do it. They even doubled back at one point to throw the army off, but the Tonkawa scouts were able to determine where they eventually headed. The following day, Mackenzie finally caught sight of the Comanche again. Far in the distance, but within a mile or so, they could catch traces of them. They began to find buffalo robes and lodge poles, equipment of all kind that the Comanche were dropping. If these pieces of equipment were not important, they wouldn't have been carrying them. The Comanche were desperately trying to lighten the load, but there was nothing Quanah was going to be able to do. The Comanche were tiring, and the army was going to be able to overtake them. But as if it were an act of God, the temperature began to plummet, and a norther blew in. A sudden gale-force wind from the north, accompanied by a solid sheet of black clouds. Within hours, freezing rain stiffened the clothes of the soldiers, who were now 50 miles from their supplies. Mackenzie felt compelled to call off the pursuit. As the Comanche escaped into the night, the soldiers made camp and tried not to freeze to death before beginning their march back the next day. One more disaster at Blanco Canyon. This is where we started our story, at the beginning of the video. In the aftermath of Blanco Canyon in 1871, this was Mackenzie's first time attempting to take on the Comanche on their own turf. Nothing went the way it was supposed to. His horses were run off, his men had been ambushed, and a whole Comanche village had escaped. You might recall he even caught an arrow in the leg on his return trip, but Mackenzie was obsessed, and the kind to learn from his mistakes. Outside of aggressive expansion and military pressure, the remaining plains tribes, like the Quahadi, had other worries. The biggest two went hand in hand: technology and the killing of the buffalo. In the decades prior, the Comanche held a distinct military advantage over white-mounted forces. Groups with heavy artillery could cause serious problems for them, but the Comanche just wouldn't engage. They would move on and out of their range faster than they could be pursued. Light cavalry had rifles that in a vacuum had longer ranges than Comanche bows. But fights don't stop after the first volley. Once those old muzzle-loading rifles were empty, the best anyone could do against the Comanche was take cover and hope to keep some rifles loaded so they were forced to stay at a distance. But things changed. First, the Texas Rangers employed Colt revolvers beginning in the 1840s. They themselves completely changed the way whites were able to fight the Comanche because their firing rates could now match Comanche bows. Future lever-action carbines, like what many of Mackenzie's soldiers used in Blanco Canyon, gave a similar advantage. But then came the buffalo guns, and the buffalo hunters. Men armed with long-range Sharps rifles, firing black powder cartridges with effective ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. For those of us less inclined to math, that's over half a mile. Buffalo hides also became big business in 1870 with the ability to make them into high-grade leather. The animals roamed the plains by the millions, and this immediately attracted entrepreneurs to take advantage of this new profitable enterprise. Within a year, large-scale slaughter had started. The pictures of the bones are astounding. 5 million buffalo were killed between 1871 and 1872 by these hunters. Megafauna does not reproduce quickly. When these animals were killed en masse, their populations were never going to recover. Another factor is that with a rifle, the animals were easy to kill. They are slow and not quick to flee from danger. By 1874, buffalo herds were becoming difficult to find, a serious problem when it is your primary source of food and shelter. Following the Battle of Blanco Canyon in 1871, Comanche raids in the area stopped. This was relatively normal moving into winter. Raids were often long-distance activities, and the warriors needed forage for their horses in order to make successful trips. The following year, in 1872, McKenzie started to change his strategy. A question that plagued him is how the Comanche were able to survive on the plains. It was common knowledge among whites that the high plains were an unlivable wasteland, a forbidden zone for the army. But McKenzie was convinced that if groups like the Comanche could live there, then the U.S. military could find a way. The best way I've ever seen Mackenzie's plan described is that he was going after the wolves in their den, to seek the Comanche out where they lived. He knew that finding the Comanche was incredibly difficult within itself, and he learned at Blanco Canyon something very important. In Mackenzie's biography, by Charles M. Robinson, it says that Mackenzie was aware that an enemy without a base or mobility is a defeated enemy, and that he became content to terrorize the Indians and destroy their villages, supplies, and horses. The last measure of desperation in the Comanche escape at Blanco Canyon was dropping precious supplies, the lodge poles and buffalo skins they needed for shelter. Mackenzie's plan was an intense, scorched earth plan. For the first time, he had soldiers traverse the entirety of the high plains, the whole expanse. They also began working on maps so that when the time came, the army would be able to navigate. The area was huge, the size of Ohio. He didn't find many Comanche, with one meaningful exception, the battle at North Fork. He was able to track down and attack a village of a Comanche chief named Maui, or Shaking Hand. In doing so, they killed over 20 Comanche, took over 100 prisoners, and captured about 50 Comanche horses. An incredible success. Mackenzie knew that the Comanche who escaped would come for their horses, but he hadn't worked out yet how to protect them. When the warriors did come, they got them all back. Despite knowing how the Comanche would behave, they were still elusive and incredibly skilled. What was a significant victory for Mackenzie was blemished by losing much of what he had taken. But moving forward, he had a plan for that too, one that matched his scorched earth policies. In 1873, Mackenzie spent his time trying to track down free Comanche, Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and others. He even got into a bit of hot water after illegally hunting down tribes in Mexico. It was very clearly out of his jurisdiction. His obsession was taking a toll on him. After years of constant stress and work, his health was struggling. Injuries of the past were leading to rheumatism in different body parts. He was highly irritable, even telling soldiers that if they didn't follow his orders that he would shoot them. But his campaigns were effective. By the end of 1873, the Kiowa Comanche on the plains were pretty quiet. The uptick in military presence had made it difficult for them to raid, and when they did, they were often pursued relentlessly. By 1874, tribes like the Quahadi left on the plains were growing increasingly desperate. On small raids, some important Kiowa and Comanche had been killed. A Kiowa chief, Lone Wolf, lost a son. Quanah had lost a nephew. This led them and other Native American leaders to call for one final resistance. And Mackenzie knew it too. He had gotten word that the Comanche were starting to collect weapons. Desperation often clouds judgment. It will lead to people making inadvisable choices, or listening to people that they probably shouldn't. Over 2 years had passed since the Battle of Blanco Canyon. Although most of the Quahadi had been able to avoid Mackenzie's forces in that time, they were disorganized. They felt the pressure being put on them by the Americans, and it was becoming obvious that there was less game on the plains. Many felt for them to have a chance, the remaining Indians would have to unite and form a last stand against the Americans. Luckily for the Comanche, a new leader had descended from the clouds after having a chat with the Great Spirit, who bestowed him with great power, or puha, rarely seen among mortal men. The medicine man from the heavens could raise the dead, control the weather, cough up crates of bullets, and more importantly, protect himself and his people from guns. Well, at least that's what the medicine man Isatai claimed. Custom and the belief in medicine, or power, is essential to Comanche behavior. Everything they did is in alignment with their beliefs. Men who claimed to have great abilities were often treated with having great power, and if people believed it, they would often go along with them. To a modern society, the declarations seem nearly comical. But the Comanche were desperate, and this was their way. They even had a target at a familiar location, Adobe Walls, the same place where back in 1864 the Comanche had run off Kit Carson. Buffalo hunters had recently taken up residence there. The era of hide men was in full swing. The settlement was small, just a few buildings and a palisade to serve a few hundred buffalo hunters in the area. The Comanche viewed buffalo hunters the same way that they viewed surveyors in the decades prior. These men were actively intruding on their lands and killing off their way of life. There was nothing they could have hated more. Isa Tai, with his medicine, wanted the Comanche to attack the location. Quanah Parker agreed. To prepare, Isa Tai taught the Comanche a sun dance. These didn't exist in their culture, but this was meant to signal change. It was taken from other tribes who had a deeper religious tradition than the Comanche. In many tribes, sun dances were multi-day affairs, often including elements of fasting and withstanding of pain among participants. Doing the sun dance demonstrated how things would be different. Isa Tai promised the Comanche that if they followed him, they would be protected, and they would have victory. With spirit and determination, Quanah Parker and his Quahadi band were ready to engage the Americans again. This is something Quanah would have wanted to do regardless of Isa Tai, as he hated the invading whites now more than ever. On June 27, 1874, Quanah Parker and nearly 700 warriors made up of Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne descended on Adobe Walls. Only 28 hunters were present, but they were awake when the attack happened in the morning. One of the hunters, Billy Dixon, wrote about what he saw. Quote, "There was never a more splendidly barbaric sight. In after years, I was glad I had seen it. Hundreds of warriors, the flower of the fighting men of the southwestern plains tribes, mounted upon their finest horses, armed with guns and lances, and carrying heavy shields of thick buffalo hide, were coming like the wind. Over all was splashed the rich colors of red, vermilion, and ochre. On the bodies of the men, on the bodies of the running horses, scalps dangled from bridles. Gorgeous war bonnets fluttered their plumes. Bright feathers dangled from the tails and manes of the horses, and the bronzed, half-naked bodies of the riders glittered with ornaments of silver and brass." End quote. It's wild to me how similar the accounts of white settlers are when they witness Comanche hordes coming down on them. You get the sense of real amazement and terror, and the accounts are consistent, with numbers that were essentially 40-1. It should have been a slaughter, but Isa Tai's medicine didn't pull through. The Indian raiders got within the small town on the first day, but behind locked doors and walls, the hunters were able to repel the attackers. They attempted to regroup at a safe distance, but now the long-range buffalo guns caused serious problems for the warriors. Native Americans were not experts at siege warfare. They were raiders. Their preferred style of attack was to get in and get out, to overwhelm a surprised opponent, take the things they came for, and leave back to safety. That is what this attack was meant to be. But they had to regroup and change. Siege warfare was different. They trapped the inhabitants of Adobe Walls for days, but at a distance. Confidence in Isa Tai fell in those few days, as the medicine man refused to get within rifle range. To the Comanche, it was as if he didn't believe in his own puha. He may have been right to stay away, as the rifle ranges were further than they even knew. On the third day, Billy Dixon, the man from the quote before, shot a Comanche off his horse at 1,500 yards. That is not an exaggeration. That is a matter of record. There are witnesses on both sides. It's an incredible testament to how far gun technology had come. Even Quanah was wounded in the fighting. He was hit by a ricochet. With the medicine clearly broken, the Comanche and their allies were forced to retreat. It was just as well, because forces were coming to assist the hunters, and staying longer wouldn't have helped them. Isa Tai's promises of protection gave the Comanche hope, but they failed. In the end, he blamed the Cheyenne for having tainted his medicine. They killed a skunk before the battle. At the second battle of Adobe Walls, it's estimated that 30 warriors were killed. It is hard to know for sure, as it was common practice among plains tribes to recover their injured and dead. 15 bodies were left in the field, too close to the buffalo guns to be recovered. But the impacts of this battle were far worse for the Comanche than losing precious warriors. The event triggered the U.S. military and Colonel McKenzie to launch a new massive offensive against the remaining plains tribes, the Red River War, the final war of the Comanche. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls was the last straw for the Americans. Already, Colonel Mackenzie had been actively hunting them, but now they were bringing more to help. At the onset of the Red River War in 1874, there were only 3,000 Comanche left, with most residing in the Texas Panhandle due to their proximity to reservations. It was very common for the free tribes to rely on reservations, to hide and to try to get rations. The plan was simple: box the Quahadi in and either force them to surrender or destroy them. From the north, Colonel Nelson Miles, a man who will make a name for himself, especially against the Apache, would head south with a company from Fort Dodge. 2 others would head west from Fort Sill and east from Fort Bascom, respectively. Mackenzie would start from the south, moving north from Fort Concho. They were trying to compress the Comanche on the high plains and force them into conflict. The American campaign, slightly more thought out than before, would be unique, as it would largely be an anti-guerrilla campaign that would stay on patrol until the job was finished. Nearby, permanent supply bases were established to allow the Americans to maintain their firepower advantages, whereas the Comanche would be forced to protect their elderly women and children and struggle to stay supplied. The Americans were tired of pursuing the Comanche. They were not leaving until the job was finished. The force patrolled for Indians for 4 or 5 months, engaging in small skirmishes throughout this time. Mackenzie was in pursuit of making a devastating blow. That opportunity arrived on September 25th. The Americans received word of a large village, chock full of supplies. The Comanche were banking on what they had to get them through the coming winter months. Mackenzie's 4th Cavalry approached Palo Duro Canyon over-prepared with close to 600 soldiers and 32 Indian scouts, many of them Tonkawa. The journey through the canyon was not easy. Night fell, and camp had to be set before engaging with the Native Americans. That night, Mackenzie made a point to not make the same mistakes he made at Blanco Canyon or North Fork. He took precautions to protect their horses, not just guarding them. He had the men tie their legs together so they couldn't run. Just as predicted, the Comanche attacked that night, just as they had previously, but this time they failed to steal and stampede the horses. Mackenzie's obsession had made him prepared. Some Comanche were discovered in the morning, but they retreated. Mackenzie had his men prepare the mules for 12 days of travel in pursuit of the rumored village. He could feel he was close, and took extreme measures to be sure. Mackenzie learned of the exact location by stretching a Comanchero, a trader that would deal with the Comanche on a wheel. The Tonkawa scouts then verified the location. Mackenzie marched his men there at a grueling pace and arrived there on the 28th of September. The Americans entered the canyon and descended to the floor using a narrow pass. They remained undetected as a Kiowa chief had apparently told the Comanche that they were in no danger of being attacked at their given location. The Comanche slept in, and as they often did while they felt safe in Comancheria, didn't post any watchmen. Mackenzie's forces moved in. When the soldiers were nearly upon them, the Comanche mounted a desperate resistance to cover the escape of their families. Sergeant John Charlton wrote how, quote, "They attacked us from every quarter, first by dozens, later by hundreds. Many were concealed behind rocks, while others were ambushed in the foliage of cedars. The warriors held their ground for a time, fighting desperately to cover the exit of their squaws and pack animals. But under the persistent fire of the troops, they soon began falling back." End quote. Surprised, outnumbered, and outgunned, the Indians abandoned their lodges. They left behind tons of buffalo robes and dried meat, as well as a ton of other important goods. Army blankets, tinner snips, stone china, cooking kettles, breech loaders with ammunition, bales of calico, and sacks of flour. Possibly infuriatingly, much of these supplies had come from the reservations. A contingent of Mackenzie's forces pursued the fleeing Comanche for 4 miles, killing 4 warriors before returning to the main division. With the main village now abandoned, Mackenzie ordered it to be burned. Bonfires roared. The scent of burning buffalo meat filled the air along with the smells of scorched Indian Department flour and sugar. Around 3 o'clock, his companies climbed back up the canyon walls, this time with 1,424 captured horses. The last time the Comanche who had fled returned to recover their horses, Mackenzie refused to let that happen again. He ordered the horses shot, all of them, minus a small percentage, given to the scouts and some others. It's been reported that the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon was marked by the piles of bones from the dead horses. The Comanche had now lost nearly all of their supplies, and a huge number of their mounts. Mackenzie had done it. The destruction of the last Comanche homestead had ensured that the age of their power was over. All that was left was for Quanah and the other chiefs to bring them in. With all of their provisions captured and destroyed before winter, Mackenzie received word that the Plains Indians were much frightened, and that even these staked Plains bands of Quahadis were going to the reserve in a few days. Not shockingly, Mackenzie was put in command of Fort Sill. Over the course of the next few months, previously hostile bands surrendered on a regular basis. By February 1875, Lone Wolf's Kiowa came in. In March, almost 1,000 Southern Cheyenne did too. But Quanah Parker's Quahadi continued to hold out on the high plains. There were only around 400 of them left, free, maybe only 100 warriors. Mackenzie now tried diplomacy. He sent a small group into the field with a Comanche chief who had surrendered, Wild Horse. Together they were able to track down the band. The Quahadi were in rough shape. The winter had been hard on them, and it was clear that getting food was becoming difficult. They held council for 2 days, but in the end, Quanah agreed to surrender. Prior to the meeting, he had had a vision while meditating. He said that he prayed to the Great Spirit for guidance and saw a wolf. It howled at him and ran in the direction of Fort Sill. An eagle who swooped down at him did the same thing. Quanah took this as his sign. All he wanted was to be given the chance to hunt as he made his way there. He and his band left for Fort Sill in early May 1875. On their way, they tried to enjoy their last bit of freedom, but it was clear that their way of life was over. The buffalo were nearly gone. They arrived on June 2nd, where Quanah was greeted by Ranald Mackenzie. Quanah and his band of Quahadi finally entered Fort Sill in June of 1875. Once the most fearsome and powerful tribe on the plains, they were overwhelmed by the U.S. military and Ranald Mackenzie. They were his obsession. But what happened next was maybe unexpected. Mackenzie had been so brutal in his pursuit that you would assume that he would have commanded Fort Sill with an iron fist. But he didn't. One of his first actions when Quanah arrived in Fort Sill was to reach out and try to find his mother, Quanah Parker, who had been recaptured at Peace River 15 years earlier. This was an incredible act of kindness, but not one with a happy ending. Quanah had always wanted to return to the Comanche. Even though she was born white, she was Comanche. She wanted to return to her son, husband, and tribe. Her daughter, Prairie Flower, had died of pneumonia in 1864. After that, Quanah became very depressed, began refusing to eat and drink, and died in 1871. Quanah was devastated to learn his mother had died, but was grateful to Mackenzie for trying to reunite him with her. Quanah even offered to return to Mackenzie the prized gray pacer he had stolen from him years earlier in Blanco Canyon. Mackenzie refused the offer. The two would go on, in a way, to become friends. Mackenzie respected the Quahadi more than many other tribes. They fought together to improve conditions on the reserve. Mackenzie even spent time to teach Quanah white customs and manners, but from there their paths diverge. Quanah Parker quickly acclimated to the new way of life. He became chief of all Comanche, not just Quahadi. He found great success as a rancher, and even became friends with Theodore Roosevelt. He was at his inauguration, and together they went on a wolf hunt. Quanah died on February 23, 1911, at 66 years old. Mackenzie continued to serve, even being promoted to brigadier general in 1882. But he fell from a wagon and had a severe head injury. This was different than the injury that gave him his nickname. He wasn't able to fully recover, and he was changed. He became unstable and retired in 1884 after being declared insane. He died a few years later in 1889, but he will always be remembered for conquering the Comanche.